So I was scrolling through Xiaohongshu the other day, the massive Chinese social media platform, and I stumbled upon something genuinely bizarre. Amidst the usual sea of fashion influencers and luxury travel vlogs, one specific face just kept appearing in my feed. It wasn't a K-pop idol or a movie star. It was a middle-aged Korean politician, Lee Jae-myung. And what really caught my eye wasn't some clip of a dry political speech, but his mukbang videos. I mean, there are thousands of posts showing him in these crowded markets, hunched over a bowl of noodles or grabbing street food, and he's eating with this intense, relatable gusto. To the hundreds of millions of users on that app, he's become this unlikely folk hero, the poor boy who became a human rights lawyer, who, still knows how to enjoy a commoner's meal. The comment sections are just flooded with a level of affection you usually see reserved for top-tier celebrities. Now, if you've been following the conservative press in Seoul or Tokyo lately, you'd get a completely different picture, a totally different story. They've been framing his recent visit to China as a total non-event, a desperate trip that yielded, and I'm quoting here, zero results. They describe a cold reception, empty diplomatic gestures. But then you look at the actual movement on the ground. While the pundits were all dismissing the trip as a failure, the economic giants were quietly moving pieces across the board. Samsung and Hyundai were signing MOUs for stable rare earth supplies. And even more significantly, Tencent and Alibaba reached an agreement to link Chinese consumers directly to Korean e-commerce platforms like Naver and Coupang. What's even more striking is the timing. Historically, the Chinese government almost never hosts high-level foreign guests in the weeks leading up to the Lunar New Year. It's a period of total domestic focus. Yet for Lee Jae-myung, they broke that protocol. So it leaves you with this glaring contradiction. Why is the mainstream media calling this a failure when 1.4 billion people are being primed to buy Korean goods through the face of a man they now treat like a superstar? And why would Beijing break its own long-standing diplomatic traditions for a visitor the news says is completely irrelevant? There is a massive gap between the narrative we're being told and the reality unfolding in the digital markets of China.
That is the core puzzle we are diving into today. This deep dive is all about deconstructing that massive gap, between the geopolitical narrative and the economic reality. We're using the source material political analysis, trilateral economic reports, and market data to understand the strategic integration, the political shifts, and the deep-rooted economic synergy that is actually unfolding between China, Japan, and South Korea, the CJK region. It's all happening far beneath the surface-level geopolitical noise. Our mission is to analyze this contradiction and uncover how strategic economic necessity is, it's overriding traditional political friction in Northeast Asia.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole failure narrative immediately. The conservative press, they saw the visit, they analyzed the predictable high-level diplomatic statements and just concluded it was a flop, a cold shoulder for Seoul.
Right. But the true measure of a strategic engagement isn't necessarily in the joint communique, is it? It's in the binding agreements that are secured by the major industrial players. And that's where the sources point to just undeniable success.
Absolutely. It's about contrasting the political noise with the undeniable economic facts that were happening at the exact same time.
That's right. The high-level movements revealed specific, crucial economic victories that fundamentally stabilized key parts of South Korea's industrial base.
And the most foundational of these deals, it involves the industrial giants. We're talking about Samsung and Hyundai securing agreements for stable rare earth supplies. This isn't just some minor supply contract. This is like a strategic insurance policy.
No, it's far more than minor. To call it a zero-result visit when two of the world's most advanced industrial firms secure guaranteed long-term access to rare earths from the world's primary supplier, it's simply disingenuous. Rare earths are indispensable. They aren't just specialty materials for niche products. They are the bedrock of the entire modern industrial supply chain. We're talking about materials that are essential for permanent magnets in EV motors, for the catalysts in petroleum refining, for the sensors in advanced electronics, and crucially, for precision guidance systems in defense hardware.
And the strategic importance is just amplified by what's happening globally, right? The US and Europe are right now scrambling to secure their own rare earth supply chains, trying to diversify away from China. They're spending billions on domestic mining and processing projects that won't yield any results for years. Meanwhile, South Korea walks away from this so-called failure trip with a signed MOU guaranteeing their core industry's stability.
That is the crucial context. In an increasingly fragmented and weaponized global environment, where major powers are explicitly using resource control as a geopolitical lever. Securing a guaranteed, stable supply of these critical materials gives Samsung and Hyundai a significant competitive edge. It insulates them, at least partially, from future supply shocks or tariffs or export restrictions China might impose on rival nations. It demonstrates, on Beijing's part, a willingness to carve out an exception and prioritize industrial stability within this CJK triangle, even if the diplomatic optics are a little chilly. This is strategic necessity just completely overriding political grievance.
And this industrial stability alone, it completely refutes the failure narrative. But where it gets even more fascinating is in the digital sphere. This is an entirely different scale of integration. We're moving beyond just input materials right into the consumer ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's effectively creating a seamless digital economic zone between South Korea and China.
That was the second and equally landmark agreement. Tencent and Alibaba are reaching a deal to link Chinese consumers directly to Korean e-commerce platforms. We're talking Naver and Coupang. This just dissolves so many of the historic barriers to cross-border commerce, specifically for the South Korean export market.
Right. Let's humanize this for a second. What does this digital synergy actually mean in practical terms for someone in Shanghai who wants to buy a new product from a Korean SME?
Well, historically, they might have used platforms that lacked direct logistical integration or faced high fees or had to deal with complex currency conversions that just, eroded trust. Now, through this infrastructure linking, Chinese consumers can browse and select Korean products directly on platforms they already trust and are used to, like Naver Shopping or Coupang. And critically, they can pay using their familiar digital wallets, Tencent Pay or Alibaba Pay, bypassing major currency conversion friction points. And then they have the goods shipped with coordinated logistics straight to their address in China.
So we're talking about dissolving the core friction points, cross-border payment, logistics, and crucially, consumer trust, all in one agreement. This isn't just a handshake deal. This requires deep back-end integration between these massive tech companies.
Absolutely. The sources specifically highlight that this strategic integration of Chinese digital payment giants with South Korean e-commerce platforms is a transformative model. It's a mechanism for regional economic synergy and industrial supply chain stability that's built on digital infrastructure. So while the political establishment might bigger, millions of consumers are being given a frictionless, trusted path to exchange goods. And as the sources note, the reverse direction, Korean consumers buying Chinese goods, that's already well underway in South Korea. This new agreement just standardizes and accelerates the flow in the crucial outbound direction for Korean exports. It guarantees market access to 1.4 billion people.
And then there's just the sheer diplomatic gravity of the visit's timing, the protocol breach, as you called it. You mentioned that historically the Chinese government rarely hosts high-level foreign guests in the weeks leading up to the Lunar New Year. That's a long-standing diplomatic rule. Domestic focus takes precedence.
Breaking that protocol is a loud, unambiguous signal. It underscores a strategic calculation by Beijing that stabilizing relations with South Korea, a critical neighbor and high-tech manufacturing power, is simply too important to put off. In a world defined by increasing global uncertainty and friction, particularly with the U.S. attempting to decouple supply chains, solidifying the Northeast Asian economic core becomes paramount.
So it suggests that Beijing views the goal of strengthening Northeast Asian trade relations, this mutual infrastructure development, as a high-level, urgent diplomatic priority. They were willing to alter their deep-rooted diplomatic tradition just to accommodate Li.
That prioritization is key. It indicates that the goal of preserving regional economic stability outweighs the adherence to diplomatic schedules. They prioritize stabilizing trade with South Korea over strictly adhering to diplomatic tradition, which confirms the source analysis that pragmatic leadership and these state-led economic MOUs are the true focus here.
And this leads us right back to the cultural element, the social media success story, which now feels less like an anecdote and more like a strategic asset.
Exactly. Li's persona, this poor boy who became a human rights lawyer, and his mukbang videos have made him incredibly popular on platforms like Xiaohongshu. He has achieved a genuine, widely shared public affection in China. This isn't accidental. It's cultural resonance and a public perception of relatable pragmatism.
And this popularity, this cultural wildcard, it acts as a profound diplomatic lubricant, doesn't it? It justified the protocol breach. Beijing could calculate that hosting him, even during the holiday, would result in immediate, highly visible public relations success, because he is already a folk hero to the masses.
It functions as a powerful catalyst for strengthening bilateral trust and collective economic prosperity. While formal, often-stalled diplomatic channels struggle with geopolitical and historical issues, this public goodwill, amplified by social media, allows the economic transactions, like the Alibaba-Naver deals, to proceed with greater momentum and perceived public support. It bypasses the traditional diplomatic inertia and makes the success of the trip undeniable to the Chinese public, even if the foreign press writes it off. It's modern economic statecraft operating through cultural appeal.
So we've established that the China trip was an economic success disguised as a diplomatic failure. But that success hinges on Li Jaemyung's ability to execute this kind of high-level, interest-based diplomacy. And to do that, he had to undertake a massive domestic political transformation.
That's the pivot. Li Jaemyung, traditionally known as a populist left-wing figure, has executed a very visible and deliberate shift to the political center in South Korea. And this strategic repositioning is what enables his pragmatic overseas engagements.
This is where that South Korean political slang, right-clicking, comes into play, right? The strategic shift toward the political center. What does that tactical move actually look like in practice?
It's a complete rebranding. He has intentionally recast his image from a strident, ideologically focused left-winger to a centrist champion of economic revitalization, industrial competitiveness, and critically, national resilience. His messaging has consciously moved away from traditional progressive ideological purity and focused relentlessly on tangible, pragmatic economic outcomes for the average Korean family. The sources suggest this focus on economic statecraft resonated precisely because voters are just weary of ideological battles.
And we can actually quantify the traction this shift has gained. There's specific polling data, particularly in traditionally conservative regions. We're talking about massive shifts in support just between March and May 2025.
The polling data is highly instructive because it shows his message is penetrating the conservative strongholds. In the Daegu and Gyeongbuk regions, which are historically the core conservative base of South Korean politics, his polling climbed substantially. It went from 19% to 34%. And even more dramatically, in the crucial industrial regions of Busan, Ulsan, and Gyeongnam, his support soared from 27% to 41%.
That swing, especially in those regions, suggests that a significant number of conservative or ambivalent voters are responding to a leader who projects stability, economic competence, and moderation, irrespective of his past left-wing identity. He's selling outcomes, not just ideology.
Exactly. Voters are fatigued by crises, and they're drawn to the promise of stability. This traction indicates that Li is successfully capturing the new center voters who prioritize economic stability and industrial competence above any kind of partisan alignment. The pivot works because it speaks to the shared anxieties about the global economy.
But this ability to pivot so strategically, it relies on his institutional control of his party. Following his nary 2022 presidential loss, Li successfully consolidated control of the Democratic Party, sidelining rival factions, including those associated with former President Moon Jae-in.
And that consolidation is crucial to understanding the speed and agility of this new foreign policy. The sources note that the DP now operates primarily as a personalist vehicle. Now, for the listener, this academic term basically means that the party's structure, strategy, and messaging are driven almost solely by the leader's brand, personality, and immediate political goals. It bypasses traditional party doctrine or committee review. It makes the party nimble and responsive to public mood, but the sources do caution it currently lacks a deep, unified ideological agenda.
And that organizational flexibility allowed for the rapid execution of a pragmatic trip to China, free from the kind of internal ideological scrutiny a more traditional party structure might have imposed.
Yes, but this power consolidation leads to a delicate balancing act domestically. He holds a supermajority in the National Assembly, which gives him sweeping institutional control, a powerful mandate. Yet, the sources also clearly warn that Korean voters are deeply wary of unchecked power.
That's the classic South Korean political paradox, isn't it? Voters demand strong leadership, but the moment that power appears unilateral or potentially imperial, public support can just evaporate.
Analyst Park Sung-min specifically cautions on this point. Li's continued success depends on his ability to project moderation while wielding massive institutional power. He needs to demonstrate that his power is focused on national unity and economic competence, rather than leveraging it for ideological dominance or, settling old political scores. If his image starts to look like an imperial presidency, he risks repeating the cyclical political crises that have plagued the country.
Okay, let's turn to the most critical foreign policy test, the U.S. alliance. Li was once known for a degree of nationalist skepticism toward Washington. Now, he's reframing the US-ROK alliance as an essential pillar of South Korea's security and economic strategy.
This transformation is the clearest signal of transactional pragmatism. He acknowledges the necessity of the alliance in the current geopolitical landscape, particularly as a security hedge against regional instability. But his framing of it is entirely utilitarian.
And we have the quote from his February 2025 appearance on the popular Sampro TV YouTube channel. He described the US-ROK relationship as a special alliance that must be used well. That phrase, must be used well, is extremely telling.
It is. It frames the relationship not as some sacred ideological bond, but as a strategic asset to be leveraged for maximum national gain. It implies utility, negotiation, and strategic benefit, not blind, uncritical alignment. He explicitly followed up on that statement by cautioning against uncritical alignment, signaling a desire for ROK autonomy and economic foreign policy, even while relying on U.S. security guarantees.
And this philosophy, economic statecraft, is the new organizing principle. His priorities are clear. Using diplomatic relationships to deepen collaboration in strategic sectors like shipbuilding, defense exports, high-tech supply chains, basically anywhere South Korea holds distinct comparative advantages.
And that pivot was cemented institutionally by his appointment of Kim Hyun-dong in February 2025. Kim is a veteran of the highly complex US-ROK FTA talks, someone who understands the minutiae of balancing trade interests against diplomatic pressures. Putting a renowned trade policy expert in such a prominent foreign policy role signals unequivocally that economic stability, industrial cooperation, and securing favorable trade terms, not ideology, are what drive his decisions.
So Lee's entire political maneuver, culminating in the China trip, is really a test case for South Korea's progressives. The core question is whether this pivot from populist idealist to pragmatic economic champion is a genuine strategic renewal based on new geopolitical realities, or is it just a temporary campaign veneer designed to win over that ambivalent new center electorate?
The sources suggest that while some skepticism lingers in Seoul and Washington, the sheer volume and speed of the policy changes. The strategic appointments, the sustained rhetoric, and the tangible overseas economic deals he secured. They all point toward a profound and likely enduring embrace of strategic economic survival. His willingness to align with elements of economic nationalism when it benefits Korea's exports, and his commitment to interest-based negotiations demonstrate that this is a system built around utilizing relationships for concrete economic gains. The pivot appears to be systemic rather than merely superficial. Now we can pull back to the absolute biggest picture, the immense macroeconomic reality that both necessitates and enables Lee's pragmatic maneuvers. These individual deals, the rare earths, the digital linking, they are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a deep structural fusion required by the scale of the CJK region. We're drawing heavily on the comprehensive 2025 Trilateral Economic Report here.
The scale is just colossal. When you aggregate the economic power of China, Japan, and South Korea, you realize this is the engine room of global manufacturing and technology.
Absolutely. The 2024 statistics underscore their global dominance. Their combined GDP reached an astonishing $24.21 trillion. That represents over 24% of global GDP.
A quarter of the world's economy.
Exactly. Their total population is 1.584 billion people, nearly one-fifth of humanity. And in global trade, the region collectively accounts for a staggering 21.0% of world exports and 16.5% of world imports.
That concentration of economic power and technological edge, particularly in high-tech manufacturing, digital services, advanced materials, it makes the CJK region not just large, but fundamentally indispensable to the functioning of global supply chains.
It is the single most important anchor in global supply chains outside of North America. The report highlights that despite global uncertainty, the region's economic growth has remained modest but profoundly resilient. Crucially, the volume of trade in goods for the CJK region reached an estimated $8.93 trillion in 2024. This intra-regional trade acts as a critical stabilizer for the global system, buffering against external demand setbacks in Europe and North America. They collectively possess the scale, the technological advantage, and the robust trade linkages needed to drive structural transformation, but only if they work together.
So the economic interdependence isn't just a beneficial consequence of proximity. It's a necessary precondition for their continued resilience. But this deep fusion is also necessitated by a shared existential threat that requires coordinated action.
That is the elephant in the room, the demographic headwind. All three economies face profound, long-term demographic shifts driven by rapid aging and historically low fertility rates, and this challenge cannot be solved by any single nation acting alone.
And the sources provide some stark specifics about this aging crisis, especially when you compare it to the rest of the world.
The contrast is shocking. While the global average of the population aged 65 and over is around 10%, the CJK numbers are dramatically higher. Japan is already at 30%, South Korea is rapidly approaching that at 18%, and even China, despite its massive overall population, is at 14% and accelerating fast. On top of that, fertility rates are alarmingly low. Japan and China hover around 1.2 boosts per woman, while South Korea recently hit an exceptionally low 0.7.
A fertility rate of 0.7 that's a state of near demographic collapse. It ensures a rapid, sustained contraction of the working-age population.
Precisely. These demographic trends signal a long-term decline in population and a severe accelerating labor force contraction that will persist for generations. While current labor force participation remains robust, Japan at 81.9%, China at 74.7%, ROK at 70.1%, the size of the working age cohort is shrinking dramatically. This demographic pressure is the core engine intensifying the need for greater productivity, radical structural reform, and most importantly, deepening regional integration to maximize efficiency and compensate for shrinking domestic markets.
This Keynes cooperation not as a trade-boosting opportunity, but as an existential economic survival strategy. If they don't integrate and coordinate structural reforms, their projected long-term growth prospects are just grim.
Absolutely. The necessity is stark. The report models the consequences. Without decisive policy interventions and structural upgrades, potential growth in the broader Asia and +3 region, which the CJK nations anchor, is projected to decline significantly from 4% in 2023 to a mere 2.8% by 2050.
But what happens if geopolitical fragmentation accelerates alongside this demographic decline?
That combination is projected to have a devastating cumulative impact. If fragmentation and aging intensify, the potential growth could drop even lower, leading to a substantial cumulative negative economic impact. We're talking something equivalent to about 15% of the region's projected 2050 output.
That's a massive drag.
A massive drag, and it would disproportionately hit the CJK economies due to their high industrial complexity and export dependence. Cooperation through mechanisms like CJK-FTA is the most effective policy lever available to mitigate this decline, requiring coordinated investment in automation, AI, and green technology to sustain productivity with fewer workers.
So it seems like every conversation about trade, technology, and diplomacy in Northeast Asia eventually comes back to this one fact. They must cooperate to survive the next 30 years. The alternative is national economic stagnation, regardless of who they align with geopolitically.
And given that intense, unavoidable economic logic we've just established, the necessity of deep integration to offset these headwinds, we can now examine the institutional responses. We start with the existing trade foundation, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCE.
RCEP. It went into effect in 2021, and it's often overlooked in Western media, but it is the current backbone of regional trade. It links 10 ASEAN nations, plus the CJK countries, Australia, and New Zealand.
Its importance cannot be overstated, especially because of the sheer weight of the CJK nations within it. China, Japan, and South Korea constitute more than 80% of the total GDP of all RCEP members. China alone accounts for 61.2%, Japan 13.1%, and the ROK 6.1%.
So RCEP is not just a free trade deal. It's effectively a CJK-driven vehicle that leverages the scale of Southeast Asia to create a massive interconnected supply chain zone. What has been its tangible impact since 2021?
The impact has been profound in terms of stability and confidence. The report details that RCEP has promoted trade growth, it's stabilized complex supply chains, and fostered broad economic cooperation. And critically, it has attracted significant new investment. Greenfield investment, that's brand new foreign direct investment into production facilities, attracted to the RCEP region was valued at $243.09 billion in 2023.
That represents a phenomenal increase, a 33.9% jump just from 2021. That demonstrates that businesses are leveraging the RCEP framework to build more predictable, resilient, and integrated supply chain landscapes, precisely when the rest of the world is talking about fragmentation.
It shows that despite the political noise, the ground truth for massive corporations is that regional stability is being secured through this framework. But while RCEP provides the baseline, the CJK nations recognize they need a framework that is deeper and more focused on advanced sectors. And that brings us to the revival of the China-Japan ROK Free Trade Agreement, the CJK-FTA.
The CJK-FTA negotiations have a long, troubled history. They officially began way back in 2012, but largely stalled after 2019.
It was due to escalating geopolitical tensions between Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing, coupled with domestic political inertia.
Correct. For years, it was a political football that nobody was willing to move. However, the game changed in 2024. Talks resumed with the first trilateral summit in over 4 years, clearly aiming for a more comprehensive and high-standard agreement than RCEP.
But I have to insert some skepticism here. If the CJK-FTA stall in 2019 because of geopolitical friction, mistrust and historical disputes, why would a U.S. tariff threat suddenly make Japan and South Korea trust China more? Isn't this just trading one reliance on the U.S. for a potentially greater, more complex one on China?
That's a crucial point. And the sources suggest the answer lies in calculated self-interest. It's not about trust improving, it's about the economic calculation changing dramatically. The CJK-FTA revival is driven by necessity, not sentiment. Japan and South Korea see the U.S. threat as immediate and destabilizing to their core export models, while the CJK-FTA offers a stable, predictable, tariff-free internal market guaranteed by established legal frameworks. They are prioritizing structural stability over ideological alignment, deciding that regional integration is the best defense against external shockwaves.
So what exactly is the future vision for this revived CJK-FTA? What sectors is it targeting beyond just reducing existing tariffs?
It is entirely focused on future-facing high-value sectors. CJK-FTA is positioned to unlock new momentum in green economic cooperation. Think detailed standards for lithium-ion battery technology, joint investment in green hydrogen infrastructure, and coordinated carbon capture projects. Additionally, the digital economy is a massive focus. Harmonizing regulations for e-commerce, big data sharing, AI development, and joint smart city initiatives. The vision is to provide a unified, stable development environment amid rising global uncertainties and to drive high-value economic growth through coordinated technological effort.
And now we get to the decisive geopolitical trigger. It wasn't the internal logic, but the external threat from the U.S. that provided the urgency for this revival.
It was a shock event. Some analyses are calling it Liberation Day, the U.S. announcement in April 2025 of reciprocal tariffs and potential punitive rates against the entire ASEAN Plus 3 region. This was a direct existential threat to the export-oriented economies of Northeast Asia.
The economic implications of that move, if implemented, would be catastrophic for the CJK economic model.
Substantial and immediate. Under the projected Liberation Day scenario, the overall export effects could reach a staggering 28% for the ASEAN Plus 3 region.
28%.
It's a regional trade shock that hits their export-dependent economies directly in the gut. The sources confirm that this threat was the immediate primary motivation for strengthening internal trade mechanisms. The March 2025 trilateral meeting of industry officials was explicitly convened to fortify their trade architecture in the face of these specific U.S. tariff threats.
That perfectly connects the dots. The ROK trade minister essentially codified this response, emphasizing the need to strengthen RCEP implementation and create a robust framework for expanding cooperation through CJK-FTA negotiations in response to the U.S. actions. So external pressure is accelerating their move toward deeper regionalism.
And this acceleration aligns perfectly with China's broader foreign policy philosophy. The sources describe China's engagement in regional architecture as fundamentally pragmatic and adaptive, changing with the tide of events. China has shifted from being at times a reluctant participant in regional affairs to an active participant and potential future leader. This shift is driven by growing economic confidence and a willingness to strategically adjust its approach to meet the current geopolitical need for regional stabilization against fragmentation. They are willing to expend political capital on CJK-FTA because the strategic return on economic stability is now so high.
So China is willing to expedite cooperation with Japan and South Korea when the economic calculus dictates it, using geopolitical threats as a lever to cement that cooperation. It's pure, interest-based diplomacy, where stability is the highest commodity. Let's focus now on how this renewed commitment to cooperation translates into tangible industrial resilience, starting with the most critical sector in the entire global economy. Semiconductors.
The semiconductor industry perfectly illustrates the interconnectedness, the specialization, and the inherent structural vulnerabilities that CJK cooperation must urgently address. The trilateral dynamics are complex but crucial. South Korea dominates in specific high-end memory chips, DRAM, and MCP, Japan dominates the high-performance materials, chemicals, and precision manufacturing equipment essential for the entire fabrication process. And China is rapidly closing the manufacturing gap, particularly in system chips and older node production.
It sounds like a delicately balanced, highly efficient, but extremely fragile ecosystem, where a disruption in one corner could collapse the whole structure.
Yeah.
Where's the specific vulnerability that necessitates this trilateral dialogue?
The vulnerability lies in asymmetric dependence, a structural imbalance. On the one hand, while South Korea's memory chip trade with China might be declining slightly due to U.S. restrictions, the sheer volume remains immense. On the other hand, South Korea's dependence on Japan for essential high-performance materials and parts like specialized photoresists and etching gases remains a critical one-sided dependency. RO trade dynamics in these upstream semiconductor components are heavily tilted toward Japan. This is the weak link in the chain that geopolitical tension or a simple industrial accident could easily snap, crippling ROK's most vital industry.
So the goal of cooperation is not merely to increase trade volumes, but to achieve balanced trade and shared risk. And the sources propose concrete solutions to enhance supply chain security and resilience.
The solutions are structured and collaborative. They call for establishing a continuous dialogue platform for industrial policy coordination, increasing joint research and development initiatives, and crucially, setting shared technical standards across the three nations. The aim is to foster innovation, facilitate the sharing of complex engineering expertise, and coordinate manufacturing capabilities across the three countries to balance trade flows. By strategically reducing one-sided dependency on any single partner or external supplier, the overall supply chain security is enhanced, making the entire CJK high-tech system more resilient to external shocks.
And beyond stabilizing the semiconductor sector, the CJK economies must also address the long-term structural headwinds you mentioned earlier if they are to achieve meaningful future growth. This is about sectoral upgrading.
Absolutely. The structural challenges are immense. We noted the demographic aging, but we also must contend with geopolitical fragmentation, the decoupling pressure we just discussed, accelerating technological transformation, especially AI and automation replacing labor, and the massive cost and complexity of a climate change net zero transition. These four key secular trends are reshaping the entire region, creating a new environment where past growth models will simply not function.
And the cost of inaction is quantified clearly in the growth projections. Without intervention, we're looking at a steady terminal slowdown.
The report projects that the CJK economy's potential growth is set to decline from a decent 4.1% in 2023 to an unsustainable 3.0% by 2050. To avert this, decisive policy intervention is required. Structural transformation and aggressive sectoral upgrading are the essential levers to unlock untapped economic potential and sustain high living standards in the face of a shrinking labor pool.
So where must they focus this policy effort? Which sectors are prioritized for deep cross-border linkage to drive productivity?
The priority areas for reform, as consistently highlighted by the sources, are the highest value-added sectors. So, again, advanced semiconductors and digital services, especially 5G, 6G infrastructure and big data services. They also prioritize physical infrastructure, connectivity linking logistics networks more seamlessly, and crucially, the massive green transition. This includes coordinated investment in electric mobility and climate resilience infrastructure. And finally, human capital improvement, ensuring the shrinking workforce is highly skilled and adaptable. The conclusion drawn from the analysis is clear. The CJK economies possess the immense economic scale and technological edge required to drive this structural transformation. But they can only succeed if they deepen regional cooperation and strengthen cross-border industrial linkages, transforming necessity into competitive advantage. The entire strategy hinges on unity of action, making trips like Lee Jae-young's not political novelties, but steps on a critical strategic path.
The entire narrative we've uncovered is one where relentless economic logic and existential macro challenges are driving policy, often in direct opposition to the simplistic, high-drama geopolitical headlines. The real story is the quiet success of the market, moving ahead of the media.
And we've resolved the central contradiction today. The political noise framing Lee Jae-myung's China visit as a failure is a shallow narrative designed for domestic consumption. Beneath it, the pragmatic economic necessities driven by macro challenges like demographic aging and immediate external threats like U.S. tariffs are forcing high-level integration. This integration is visible in the strategic stability secured for rare earth supply chains and the immediate profound digital market synergy created by the Alibaba-Tencent linking with Naver Coupang. The CJK region is actively prioritizing economic statecraft and industrial supply chain stability over ideological alignment. They are hedging their future against global fragmentation by unifying their regional economy.
And what makes this transition so compelling is the personal element that traditional media missed. Li Jiamyang isn't performing as a rigid diplomat. He is the public, pragmatic face of a new, transactionally focused ROK foreign policy. His authentic, relatable appeal, the cultural connection amplified through digital platforms like Xiaohongshu, bypasses the traditional media filters that prefer the drama of geopolitical failure over the less sensational success of complex economic deals. He used cultural connection as a strategic asset to grease the wheels of commercial diplomacy.
The seamless linking of Chinese digital payment giants with South Korean e-commerce platforms has not just simplified trade, it is rapidly creating a functional, unified digital economic zone between the two nations. If this digital infrastructure accelerates, the inevitable next step for CJK cooperation must be the profound technical harmonization of data regulations, digital economy standards, and intellectual property rules across all three countries to maintain this powerful commercial momentum. This move toward deep, shared regulatory infrastructure across competitive powers suggests a future where digital sovereignty may become increasingly secondary to the expediency of regional economic integration.